Death on the Nile, a 22 film directed and starring Kenneth Branagh, is the second film adaptation of the novel Death on the Nile, written by Agatha Christie in 1937. Considered the queen of the mystery novel and one of the greatest writers in world literature, Agatha Christie made her literary debut in 1920, inaugurating with The Mysterious Affair at Styles the highly successful saga of the Belgian detective Hercule Poirot. Through the adventures of the latter and the sprightly old lady Miss Marple, she made history in the detective police genre, influencing entire generations of writers. Remembered for such absolute masterpieces as Murder on the Orient Express and 10 Little Indians, Agatha Christie is, only after Shakespeare, the most translated English writer ever, and her novels have inspired several film versions. In 2015, James Preacher, great-grandson of Agatha Christie, first expressed interest in a sequel to Murder on the Orient Express, thanks to the great chemistry and positive collaboration with Kenneth Branagh. The latter decided to bring a new Agatha Christie detective story to the big screen, in an almost intimate version, a spotlight on Poirot, this time not as a great detective, but as a man, read through his losses and sorrows, a beating and emotional heart hidden under his famous mustache. The young, beautiful, and rich heiress Lynette Ridgway married the young and handsome but far from rich Simon Doyle. Simon was already engaged to Jacqueline de Belfort, who was Lynette's best friend. The couple is now on honeymoon in Egypt and is obsessively stalked by Jacqueline, who plans to ruin their honeymoon. In addition to them, several other characters, including the Belgian detective Hercule Poirot, have boarded the boat Carnac on a cruise down the Nile. One evening on the boat, Jacqueline de Belfort, after yet another hysterical jealousy episode, pulls a gun out of her handbag and shoots Simon Doyle, hitting him in the leg. The girl, in shock, is immediately taken to her cabin, where nurse Miss Bowers administers her a powerful sedative. At this point, all would seem quiet, except that the gun, which Jacqueline had thrown to the ground after shooting, has mysteriously disappeared. The next morning, Lynette Ridgway is found dead in her cabin, killed by a gunshot to the temple. At this point, Poirot takes over the investigation, apart from Simon, unable to move with his leg out of use, and Jacqueline, kept under sedation and guarded on site throughout the night. All the other passengers are suspects, both because they lack alibis, but above all because each of them had valid reasons for holding resentment toward the victim. The next day, another victim, Louise Bourget, Lynette's young waitress, is found dead. The murderer had slit her throat. Poirot had already guessed the solution, even though, by his own admission, it had seemed impossible. Now, however, he no longer has any doubts. He gathers all the suspects in the hall to reconstruct the incident in minute detail, and with a twist, it turns out that the two culprits were indeed Simon and Jacqueline, who had previously agreed to take the inheritance of the now dead Lynette. Agatha Christie wrote Death on the Nile after a winter in Egypt. The writer set off on a steamer that traveled the route from Aswan to Wadi Alfa. As we read in a note to the novel signed by the author, there were many passengers on board, but those in the novel also traveled in her head, becoming more and more real, especially the explosive trio Lynette, Simon, Jacqueline, authentic figures who still seem as alive to us today as the passions, fears, and obsession they embody. Of course, Death on the Nile was a journey made above all in the company of Hercule Poirot, friend and partner with whom she had a complex relationship made up of ups and downs, of deep friendship and understanding, but also of an internal form of rebellion. Poirot was such a big character that it was beyond the writer's control. So here he is, welcoming us aboard the Carnac with his perfectly curled moustache. As regards its relationship with the 1937 book, Death on the Nile has been fiercely criticized by the fans of the world's best-selling author, as Barna's screen adaptation does not fully respect the work of the English author. The interesting novelty of the film, thanks to its interpreter and director Kenneth Branagh, is the human, intimate side of the Belgian detective. The prologue makes us realize how behind the rational Poirot is a man who carries with him the regret of a lost love. It is precisely that human side of him that leads him to be sensitive to details, to be alert to risks, to fight mystery and crime so that truth wins out above all else. And he succeeds, of course. The most important discrepancy between the film and the novel Death on the Nile is, however, the presence of the character of Book, who is not even fleetingly mentioned in Agatha Christie's detective story. The reasons for this choice was explained by Kenneth Branagh himself, who said he was so impressed by Tom Batesman's acting performance in Murder on the Orient Express that he wanted him as his co-star for the sequel as well. Salome Otterburn is completely turned upside down in the transition from the printed page to the big screen. She is portrayed by Agatha Christie as an eccentric alcoholic singer of British descent, and not as a charismatic black jazz performer. Moreover, in the crime book she is the last victim of Simon Doyle's plan, whereas in the film she not only descends from Carnac on her own 2 feet, but it is implied that there were many mutual romantic interests between her and Poirot. Another subplot Branagh included in his film is that of the homosexual love affair between Marie Van Schuyle and her nurse, Mrs. Bowers. On the roles and occupations of the two women, the film sticks closely to Christie's novel, but there is no trace of their relationship in the 1937 detective story, which merely refers to the relationship between the two as a friendship and nothing more. Finally, if in the book's epilogue the birth of a new couple provided a note of hope, Branagh's film, on the contrary, ends on a note of mourning, that of a detective who was unable to save his closest friend, that of Rosalie deprived of a future with the man she loved, and even more heartbreaking, that of a mother forced to mourn the son to whom she herself had denied a prospect of happiness.